Well, joining me now to look more broadly at the unofficial campaign is ABC election analyst Antony Green, who's going to be busy for the next 74 days. So we should say it's an unofficial campaign because the Prime Minister said it will probably be the 2nd of July, but actually hasn't confirmed the date. Why is that?
Well, but there's several reasons. One is an election campaign. An election campaign officially doesn't start until writs are issued. If you go to the Electoral Commission and try and nominate as a candidate or find when nominations close, they say we don't know. Because until they get the official writ stating all these dates, there isn't an election campaign, and there isn't one. So legally there isn't an election campaign. The other reason, they could name a date and not have the election campaign. Yeah, that could be weeks away. But people have got rather used to election campaign dates being announced and dissolutions occurring and writs taking place on roughly the same day. So Acts of Parliament have been written in recent years talking about when the election date is known. And there's things like the Communication Act and the Electoral Act with regards to postal voting. Once the date is known, then some of these things tick into place by accident. There's no reason that writs and dissolutions have to take place at the same time, and they won't at this election.
So now that he's mentioned around the 2nd of July, has that already triggered any sort of things in preparation?
No, I mean everyone's preparing, but there's nothing legally happening. The election, the government says it wants to have a double dissolution, and it will be the 2nd of July. The other options are the 19th and 16th. It can't be before the 2nd of July without losing a year off the government's term. The 2nd of July, they said the 2nd of July. It's going to be the 2nd of July, but they're not going to say it's the 2nd of July, and they're not going to visit the Governor-General. I mean, basically, you can't dissolve the Parliament, have an election now. One, the campaign would be too long, and legally you can't do it. Secondly, to dissolve the Parliament, well, you can't deliver a budget. So everyone just had calmed down. There's a couple of weeks and then we will have the dissolution.
So it's like saying that when you're pregnant in the first trimester, but you can't announce it to the 12-week mark.
2 years ago, John Key, the New Zealand Prime Minister, announced the election date 9 months ahead of time to ensure it didn't clash with the World Cup. Sir Robert Menzies announced the 54 election several months ahead so it didn't clash with the Royal Tour. There are reasons why sometimes you announce election dates well ahead of time.
So how many times have we had a double dissolution election?
There's been 6 previous double dissolutions. The last was in 1987.
OK, and do you know from the results of those, do double dissolution elections usually fare well for the government?
Well, double dissolution is usually also an early election. They're not an early election is not a double dissolution, but a double dissolution is almost always an early election. The previous ones in 1914, the Cook government was defeated. In 1951, Menzies was re-elected and got a Senate majority. 74, Whitlam was re-elected, and he's the only Prime Minister who ever then went on and had the joint sitting. 75 elections, the odd one out because the Whitlam government was first dismissed, and then the acting Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, called a double dissolution and was, of course, re-elected. Although he never did a joint sitting because the legislation he used was Whitlam government legislation. That's long and complex. 83, Fraser called a snap double dissolution and was defeated. In 87, Bob Hawke called a double dissolution because they couldn't have an early election otherwise, except for a double dissolution. Won the election, but then abandoned the joint sitting when they decided the legislation on the Australia card was not politically popular. OK, so now that you've got this campaign that you say we shouldn't really be talking about it, Barnaby Joyce said we shouldn't be talking about it, but the fact is everyone's going to be talking about it, and we've got 74 days of it. Do you think, do people get fatigued? Well, they will do if the media keeps talking about it. I think
you're here now talking about it.
I was invited in. I think the people are. The media are going to get more bored of it than anything. It reminds me of 2013 when Julia Gillard announced the date of the election in January, and for about the next week everybody ran multiple pages in newspapers on the election campaign and then eventually realised nothing was going to happen if they kept doing that. and I think there'll be a bit of that. There are things to do. I'm not sure there's much point in endlessly speculating every day. I mean, today must be the 3rd or 4th time in the last week everybody said it's 2 July. Well, we know it's going to be 2 July.
So I imagine there'll probably be another set. Well, there was only a set of polls yesterday, but maybe next week now that it's actually been called. What is the most important thing in those polls that we should be looking at? That two-party preferred? Well,
the first thing to say is that all those polls are there because it's a good way of selling newspapers. In the days of the internet, one of the only things that newspapers have exclusively is the opinion polls they commission. So that's why there are so many of them these days. I think it's worth looking at the two-party preferred, but I would argue that there's a lot of things to do with other voters, and in the polls only ask about first preferences, they don't ask about two-party preferred.
OK, Antony Green, thank you, and I know you'll be in here again.
Thank you.